So welcome, Mr. Bean, and thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
We invited you here today because of your long and deep history of involvement in environmental law, particularly wildlife. You graduated Yale Law School in 1973 and then were in private practice for 3 years. You worked at the Environmental Law Institute in 1976 and 1977 when you joined the Environmental Defense Fund to head its wildlife program. You were with the program for over 30 years, and you published The Evolution of National Wildlife Law, which remains the leading treatise on the topic. In 2009, you joined the Obama administration as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fish and Wildlife and Parks. In this position, you were responsible for providing policy direction and oversight to the National Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Right.
So where did you grow up, and how, if at all, did the environment play a role for you?
I grew up in a small town in Iowa on the banks of the Mississippi River, and had a profound effect upon my career, I believe, because I spent all my free time playing in the woods behind my house or on the river. A number of my friends, their families had little makeshift cabins on the riverside, and catching snakes, fishing, catching frogs, catching turtles, just being in the outdoors was really part of my childhood. And I think that had a profound effect upon my respect for nature, my interest in nature, and ultimately my career choice.
So how did that work? How did you end up deciding to go to Yale Law as a part of your career?
Well, I actually studied entomology as my first course of study as an undergraduate, although I got a degree ultimately in political science. And I didn't really know quite what to do with that degree. I was under the influence of an economics professor at the University of Iowa who suggested I go to law school. I was lucky enough to be accepted at Yale and graduated there in 1973. Came out of Yale, again, not knowing for sure what I wanted to do with myself. Went to Covington and Burling. And while I was there, I realized that corporate law wasn't really my interest or forte. I had an opportunity, however, to take an evening course that the Smithsonian offered on endangered species conservation. That was shortly after the Endangered Species Act was enacted by Congress. And the teachers were some Fish and Wildlife Service employees. And I took that course and was fascinated by the subject, and learned about a case then pending in the Supreme Court involving the Devil's Hole pupfish, and decided I would write an article about the pupfish and its pending court decision. And that article was picked up and published in the Washington Post Sunday Outlook section. About the same time, I wrote a book review for Natural History magazine about a book called Politics of Extinction by Louis Regenstein, and that got picked up immediately. So I thought, I've got a talent here I didn't realize I had of getting things published. And just at that same time, I was aware that the Environmental Law Institute was looking for someone to write a book on wildlife law. I really had no qualifications other than what I've just described, but I was lucky that nobody else had any greater qualifications, so ELI hired me and gave me an opportunity to write The Evolution of National Wildlife Law.
You were in college and law school as the environmental movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s really got started. Do you have any thoughts on what propelled that movement?
Well, I was an undergraduate during the first Earth Day. I remember the first Earth Day, although not clearly, but I do remember it taking place. I do remember as well, as an entomology student, going on a field trip and encountering a robin that exhibited all the symptoms of pesticide poisoning, which I presume was the cause of its plight. That had an effect upon me as well. And I think in general, people at that time were becoming aware of a variety of threats to the environment. DDT certainly was prominently in the news at that time. There were other concerns about air and water pollution that I think aroused a latent interest on the part of the public. And in my case, I was acutely aware that the places that I had enjoyed exploring as a kid were increasingly encroached upon by development, and the loss of habitat meant the loss of some of the creatures I cared about.
Do you have any thoughts on how it is that Congress was able to put together basically the entire bevy of environmental statutes we have today within a decade?
Well, what's most remarkable in retrospect is that was done largely on a bipartisan basis. In the case of the Endangered Species Act, the Senate voted 92-0 and the House 390-12 in support of that law. That's a level of bipartisanship one can scarcely imagine happening today. I think at that time there was just a recognition that these were important issues that hadn't been addressed, that needed to be addressed, And there was no perception then that they were Republican or Democratic issues. They were simply solid American issues. And over time, that's been an erosion of that perception.
You've been involved in environmental wildlife law pretty much since the Endangered Species Act passed in 1973. How has that act performed in terms of meeting its objectives?
Well, I think the Endangered Species Act has done well in the sense that nearly all the species that it seeks to protect are still with us, and very few of those have gone extinct. And the number of those that are now recovered and taken off the list is growing, albeit slowly. But our national symbol, the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, the brown pelican, the American alligator, and others are examples of species that have recovered to the point that they no longer need the Act's protection. There are other species like the black-footed ferret and the California condor that were once extinct in the wild. They survived only in captivity. They have been successfully bred in captivity and successfully restored to the wild. They're still endangered species, but they are species that have a far greater chance of success for the long term than they've had in many decades. So I think that has to be tallied in the success column as well. Having said that, I think more needs to be done. Clearly, we have a large and growing list of endangered species, a growing list of threats, including many that weren't really recognized in 1973, including novel diseases affecting a variety of species like our bats, as well as climate change. And so we need to be vigilant and to have a continued level of support, not only for the Endangered Species Act, but for the other environmental laws that protect our natural resources.
Do you have any thoughts on how we manage invasive species? You mentioned other threats we don't think about. We don't have a particularly strong or unified federal program on invasive species. Any thoughts on how we're doing on that?
That is a big challenge because for the most part, we respond to these threats after they've become so severe that we're stuck with them for the long term. Clearly, we need more effort to go into early detection, rapid response, so that we can become aware of potentially invasive species becoming established as quickly as possible, so that we can mobilize resources to eliminate them wherever possible or control them where not. But clearly, if you wait until they are already established and widespread, you're stuck with that very big bill for control that will never succeed in eliminating them.
What do you think are the greatest strengths of the U.S. approach to wildlife protection? Why has it succeeded as it has?
Well, I think what the Endangered Species Act has shown over the decades is a flexibility, an ability to accommodate new challenges and to find ways to incentivize conservation on the part of landowners in particular. There are a number of tools that are now part of the regular mainstay of the Act's implementation, tools like habitat conservation plans and the accompanying no surprises policy, tools like safe harbor agreements and candidate conservation agreements. Those are all tools that weren't in the Act when it was passed in 1973. Indeed, several of those, like safe harbor and CCAAs, are not even in the law today. They are administrative creations that reflect a willingness on the part of the Act's administrators to find some inherent flexibility and creativity. So I think that's been a crucial factor. It's been among the reasons why it's possible now to collaborate with states and private landowners to achieve conservation objectives.
And what do you think are the weaknesses of the Act and how it's been implemented over the years?
I think the key weakness has been that there are no or very few positive incentives to do the right thing. The Act is really focused on prohibiting harmful conduct, when for many species, what's really needed is to elicit from landowners and others beneficial conduct. So if there were more incentives, financial, regulatory, and otherwise, that would be much needed.
Do you think Congress has been a good steward of the Act? It hasn't been amended in particular. Is it really doing its job in terms of keeping the Act up to date with the changing times?
Congress last amended the Act in a substantial way in 1988, so it's been more than 25 years. And I think there have been several efforts since then, but a middle ground, if you will, has been very elusive. Those people who've tried to occupy the middle ground have come up empty-handed. I think, fortunately, that the absence of congressional action has not prevented the Act from accomplishing many of its important objectives because of the flexibility I described. It has made it necessary for the Act's administrators to to look for creative solutions to problems, and by and large they have found them without congressional intervention. Today, Congress is so divided on so many issues, it's hard to imagine them coming together on an issue like this.
And how have the successive administrations been as stewards of the Act? It sounds like they had a good bit of discretion under the Act to either really implement it well or let it slide if they wanted to.
Well, it's varied over time. I think in general, most administrations have taken seriously the obligation to call the shots on the basis of science in terms of what species are endangered or not. It becomes more challenging when there are major development projects that are up against conflicts with endangered species. But by and large, because the courts have pretty much upheld a strong and stringent interpretation of the Act, all administrations are well aware of that and have taken the Act quite seriously because of that.
Endangered species law, as you've mentioned a couple of times, often butts up against private property concerns. How has this interface changed over the years? And do you think we're now doing a fairly good job of balancing private property interests with conserving wildlife habitat?
Well, that has been a challenge, and I do think there are new tools, relatively new tools, that are helping bridge that challenge. They include tools like safe harbor agreements for endangered species in which private landowners can voluntarily improve habitat without incurring new regulatory liabilities if endangered species respond to those improvements by increasing in number and distribution. Also, new arrangements between the Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies like the Natural Resources Conservation Service through a program known as the Working Lands for Wildlife Program. Pursuant to that, NRCS is targeting its Farm Bill Conservation Program resources to areas where they will do the most good for either moving species off the list or keeping species from becoming listed. And that's a new initiative that has had some very promising results, most recently with respect to the decision not to list the greater sage-grouse.
Let's turn a little bit to the national parks.
Mm-hmm.
How are we doing in terms of managing our national parks as a society, not just as an agency?
Mm-hmm. Well, national parks are now nearly 100 years old, and next year will be the centennial of the national park system. They are often described as America's best idea, and I think with justification. They're immensely popular. Visitation numbers have always been high and are growing. But there are challenges that affect the parks. There's a substantial maintenance backlog that troubles the National Park Service. There are threats from invasive species. There are threats from climate change that present real challenges to the park system. But overall, I think the park system has been much beloved by the American public, and for good reason.
So there's been much written and much worry and concern over particularly young people's engagement with the outdoors, the engagement you talked about when you were younger. Do you see that concern reflected when you're managing the park system? Do you see Americans still going to the parks to the same degree and young people still showing an interest? I
think it is challenging to gain the interest of a younger generation that is accustomed to screens and indoor activities and in a virtual world as opposed to the natural world. Notwithstanding that, there have been substantial efforts in this administration by Secretary Jewell and others to reach out to youth, to reach out to underserved communities, to give them opportunities to experience nature firsthand. And I think those are paying dividends because I think in the long run we all recognize that the support for the parks will depend upon having firsthand experience in the parks. And so we're doing what we can to encourage opportunities such as the Every Kid in the Park campaign, which is a Park Service initiative that are designed to give young people an opportunity to see and experience firsthand what nature has to offer. And how do you manage the parks in the face of climate change? What are some of the strategies you would adopt to try to navigate that? Well, basically, to the extent we can make our landscapes more resilient to anticipated climate change, more resilient to expected drought, more resilient to frequent fire, we can have some ability to temper the effects of climate change. But ultimately, the solution really is to tackle the problem itself by trying to reduce the emissions of the greenhouse gases that are causing climate change. Because unless and until we do that effectively, we're going to be saddled with the necessity to deal with adaptation, which is an important thing to do, but not all that needs to be done.
And how does that same dynamic play out with species? When we're focusing on habitat mostly for protecting species, and that habitat may shift over time.
That's a major challenge. The historic ranges that species occupied may no longer be their future ranges, may no longer be their current ranges as they respond to changes in temperature and precipitation and so forth. I think this is a problem that has many dimensions. Certainly some of the novel diseases that we're seeing in our wildlife populations are thought to be the result of changing climate as well. So it's a whole arsenal of weapons that climate change is throwing at our natural history, and we have relatively few tools to deflect those weapons.
You talked a lot about managing landscapes and resilient landscapes. How, you may not have any thoughts on this, but there's a bit of a philosophical debate about whether nature really does exist outside of humans, given that we're talking about managing landscapes and climate change changing the entire planet. Is there really a nature? Are there national parks simply preserving leftovers that are degrading naturally anyway? How does this work in your mind?
Well, there's no denying that human influence has affected most of the landscape, including areas that are protected as wilderness or parks and so forth. The evidence of human presence is undeniable in most cases. That said, I do think nature still exerts a powerful role. We see nature perform its role in the form of periodic major weather events, and we certainly see nature at work in the way in which our wildlife and the native plants interact with each other. The migration of the monarch butterfly is a good example. It's been underway for millennia, presumably, and continues, albeit with some threats now. But it's still a remarkable phenomenon that anybody with the slightest interest in nature has to be amazed by.
I'm struck many of the examples you mentioned of wildlife being preserved were birds, and that many of the threats to them were pesticides, as well as habitat, but pesticides in particular. Have we really integrated those laws, those various environmental laws, to the maximum degree? Do you have the tools you really need to protect wildlife? And are the agencies working well together?
Well, the overriding threat to almost all wildlife is loss or degradation of habitat. It takes a variety of forms. It can mean complete elimination of habitat through development or conversion from natural landscape to agricultural fields or what have you. Pesticides and other pollutants certainly are contributing factors, but I think the overriding threat is loss and degradation of habitat. The tools to deal with that are limited. They include acquisition of lands, key lands that are vital for certain life stages of our wildlife. But they also include working with landowners to try to accommodate as much natural history on a working landscape of farms, ranches, and forest lands as possible. We have made some progress in that regard.
And how is the dynamic of the federal government working with states and localities? When states and localities have most of the land management and land use planning authority, is that a dynamic that's developed well over the years? Is there still a significant mismatch?
There are some significant accomplishments, in particular using the tool of habitat conservation planning under the Endangered Species Act in California in particular. Concerns about endangered wildlife have been integrated into local land use planning in county after county, and that has been quite a dramatic change in the way in which approaches to land use have been carried out in the past. That's not universal, it isn't true across the country, but it is very promising in the foothold that's secured in California in particular.
You were at Environmental Defense Fund from early on in its history. Can you describe the role for NGOs in environmental policy and whether that role has changed over the years?
Well, I was at EDF for more than 30 years, and EDF, I think, underwent a transition itself in that time that I was there. I arrived some 10 years after the organization was established, and its original motto, informal motto was "Sue the Bastards." By the time I left, the formal motto was "Finding the Ways that Work." I think that reflected a transition on their part from reliance upon litigation as the sole means of accomplishing their ends to a reliance upon economics and business savvy and incentives to encourage and reward beneficial behavior across a wide variety of fronts. They, of course, were intimately involved in tackling the acid rain problem through sulfur dioxide emission credit trading, and have pursued similar strategies for other problems. I think that reflected a change on their part, a perception on their part, that in order to tackle the many different challenges, you need a variety of tools. Not every problem is a nail. If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but it isn't. And they realized that and changed over time. I think to a large degree that's been the case for the environmental movement as a whole.
And do you see corporations' role and landowners' roles having changed as well? Have they adapted over the years?
Well, certainly some have exhibited much more sensitivity to their impact upon the natural environment. You see corporate sustainability policies that are novel and praiseworthy. It's not uniform, but there's enough evidence of change in enough major corporations to have some hope that will bear some real fruit.
You were at Environmental Law Institute for almost 2 years in the mid-'70s, and then you served on this board for many years as well. Any thoughts on the role ELI has played in environmental law and environmental movement?
ELI has played a singularly important role in bringing together diverse interests. Certainly the annual dinner is a reflection of how diverse the constituency of ELI is, with the private environmental bar, NGOs and others, and government agencies represented. I think ELI's convening power and its research objectivity have been critically important contributions to the evolution of environmental law for many, many decades.
Do you think there's a role, an important role for profession, an environmental profession in policy? Does it really help the fact that we have folks like yourself who've gone from NGO to government and may someday go back to another role in helping achieve cohesive policy?
I think it has been very helpful to have those sorts of professionals who've had that sort of experience. My own experience is somewhat limited. This is my first tenure in government, and so I'm still learning how government works after having thought I understood how it works. But I think lots of people have served well in a variety of capacities, both in the private for-profit sector, the nonprofit sector, and the governmental sector. And having the ability to take advantage of the expertise those people have acquired in their backgrounds has been quite important.
And what have you learned about government? Having spent 30 years in the NGO world, looking at government from the outside, now you've been inside of it for over 5 years. What surprised you?
I have a greater respect, I think, than I had even before for the quality of people who comprise our environmental agencies in the federal government. They are top-notch, both their lawyers and their other policy people. At the same time, government is challenged by a process that is oftentimes slow and difficult to work through. I think from the perspective of someone who came in from the outside, that's sometimes a bit of a culture shock, even though you are forewarned.
And what role do resources play on funding in both wildlife policy and in the agency as you've seen it? Has that been a critical issue or not?
Funding is a critical issue, and certainly in the last few years with the results of the ever-tightening belts for the budget of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Interior agencies in general, it's become more challenging to accomplish what the law requires us to do. It's become more common for us to fall behind in meeting our obligations. I like to say, quoting my friend Don Barry, that the Endangered Species Act isn't broken, it's starved, and I think that reflects the reality.
And what role does funding play in the often cited example of lawsuits being brought to demand listing of species? Is that the main issue, and how does that affect how the agency works and has discretion over its own working?
Well, the Fish and Wildlife Service does have to respond to petitions to list species, has to do so within a statutorily prescribed time frame. The volume of petitions has at times been such that the service has had difficulty meeting those deadlines, and when it fails to meet them, it's been sued. However, the Fish and Wildlife Service a few years ago consolidated a number of those lawsuits, developed a settlement agreement that allowed for an orderly approach to resolving the status of more than 250 candidate species. That has proven to be a successful and intelligent thing to have done. Among other things, it gave a clear deadline for a decision on the greater sage grouse that allowed people some 4 years, more or less, to put together conservation programs and plans that address the threats to that species in a way that ultimately avoided the need to list that species. So I think that's been one of the unanticipated but very real benefits.
When we spoke with Tom Jorling and Leon Billings, who were staff in the Senate and helped write the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, they identified putting deadlines in the statute as a major innovation and very helpful in making sure that things actually happen. Would you agree with that in terms of how that's working in the Endangered Species Act?
I think deadlines have been important. Certainly the deadlines got added, as I recall, in 1981 or 82, if I recall correctly, 82 I believe it was, in response to the perception that then Secretary Watt at Interior was not going to list anything. And so Congress, I think wisely, put some deadlines in response to petitions.
And in your perspective, what have been the most important trends or factors that shaped environmental law and policy over the past 30 years?
I think the most important factor or trend has been the recognition that environmental law needs to be informed by economics, needs to be informed by how businesses and private landowners, for that matter, make decisions, what influences their decisions, what their perspective is, and how to align their objectives with environmental objectives. I think in its early days, the environmental community was less cognizant of that, less willing to acknowledge the legitimacy of those points of view. But I think now there's a recognition that we have to understand the threats and understand the objectives of businesses and landowners if we're to solve these problems.
And of all you've done over the past 30 plus years, what are you most proud of? What makes you sleep more soundly at night?
Well, I'd like to think that I had some small impact on turning the table for at least some species that were headed toward the oblivion of extinction and now have a better chance of survival in the long term. I suppose the one thing I might have most pride in was working on the idea of safe harbor agreements where my then EDF colleague, now USDA colleague, Robert Bonney, and I really were instrumental in bringing into being safe harbor agreements which offered an opportunity for those landowners who wanted to be good stewards of their land to do that without fear of regulatory liability.
And what worries you most about the future from an environmental perspective as you look forward?
Well, we talked earlier about the growing disconnect between the coming generation and the experience of nature. I do think both because of the ubiquity of machines to look at a viral nature, not a real nature, we lose some of the motivating factor that has underlain the environmental movement's early decades. I think most of the people who were part of the first few decades of the environmental movement had extensive experience backpacking, hiking, exploring the outdoors. And I think to a degree that's diminished today. And without that experience, I can't be as confident that there will be forceful advocates for the environment in the future.
And to the counterpart, what are you most optimistic about? What gives you hope as you look forward?
Well, I'm most optimistic about the fact that people, despite these changes, do tend to care. They care about certainly their favorite places near their homes. They care about the creatures that they enjoy, whether it's the birds that come to the bird feeder in the backyard or whether it's the hunting opportunities they enjoy in the wilderness. There are enough people who care deeply enough about these things that I think the environment will continue to be a high priority for many, many Americans.
Is there anything else we haven't talked about you'd like to discuss or any other thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Only to say that I admire the role that ELI has played over the years and happy to have had the opportunity really to launch my environmental career by coming to ELI in 1976 and writing the first edition of that book, The Evolution of National Wildlife Law. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mead, for all you've done for the profession over the years, for the species, for the planet. We just thank you very much.
Thank you.